Nobody in the village had ever seen the sky behave like that. The clouds were not just gathering, they were boiling, darkening until the mountains themselves seemed swallowed by their weight. A strange silence settled over the valley. Even the dogs stopped barking. Even the sheep froze. It was as if nature held its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. A deafening roar cracked across the sky, followed by sheets of rain so heavy it felt like the heavens had torn apart. This was no ordinary rain. It was a cloudburst, angry, merciless, and determined to drown everything in its path. The villagers rushed out of their homes, their oil lamps flickering against the storm, shouting to each other in panic. The narrow lanes, usually filled with laughter and cattle bells, were suddenly rushing rivers. Doors splintered. Mud walls began to dissolve like sugar. Children cried out for their parents. Parents screamed for their children. The air was thick with fear. By the riverbank, the shepherd Roth saw his entire herd swept away. In a single moment, years of care and livelihood vanished into the black torrent. He tried to hold on to one calf tied near the shed, but the rope snapped, and the water snatched it away before his eyes. Up on the hill, Fatima clutched her newborn to her chest. As water rose inside her home, she stood on the bed, shivering, whispering prayers, while her husband hammered at the door to break it open. But the water was faster. It poured in, carrying firewood, chickens, and broken clay pots. The once peaceful village was no longer a village, it was an ocean of chaos. The ancient stone bridge that connected the two sides of the valley cracked under the fury of the flood. A thunderous sound echoed like an earthquake, and in seconds the bridge crumbled into the raging water. With it went the only safe path to the outside world. The people were trapped. The screams rose higher. Animals bellowed. The earth itself trembled. Night deepened, and with every passing minute, the water climbed higher. Families huddled on rooftops, clutching one another in desperation. But even the rooftops shook. Mud houses could not hold long. One by one, they gave way, collapsing like dominoes into the flood. The villagers tried to grab onto anything that floated: logs, doors, even the carcasses of animals that had already drowned. The air smelled of wet earth, fear, and death. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of devastation. Entire homes disappeared. Entire families were missing. The cries of animals had stopped because there were no animals left alive. The flood had devoured everything. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound broke the silence: the horn of a rescue vehicle. It was faint, uncertain, like a dying flame. But for those trapped on their rooftops, it was the sound of hope. People began to shout, wave torn pieces of cloth, anything to be seen. But the storm raged on, and the rescuers could not reach them yet. In the darkness, one old man whispered to his grandson, "Hold on, someone is coming." But deep inside, he wasn't sure. He had lived in the valley all his life and knew one cruel truth: when water wants its way, nothing stops it. Not men, not stone, not prayers. The night dragged on. The rain would not stop, and the villagers realized this was not just a storm. This was nature reclaiming its land. The clouds still hung low, heavy, bruised with black, as if the night had refused to let go. The rain slowed, but the damage had already been done. The village was broken. What once stood as homes, schools, and barns were now piles of mud and floating debris. Trucks halted at the edge of the destroyed bridge, their headlights cutting through the rain. The road had ended, but the mission had just begun. Dozens of men and women in orange jackets jumped out, their boots sinking into the slush. Behind them, ropes, stretchers, inflatable boats, and medical kits were unloaded in a rush. "Move fast, people are trapped," one of the commanders shouted. The rescuers looked down at the valley and froze. Entire sections of the village were gone, swallowed by the river. The water still roared, carrying rooftops, cow carcasses, and uprooted trees downstream. In the distance, faint cries rose and fell like echoes. Somewhere people were still alive, but reaching them looked impossible. They pushed their boats into the raging current. The river fought back, tossing them like toys. One boat flipped almost immediately, throwing two men into the water. They struggled, gasped, but their comrades pulled them back with ropes. The rescuers were drenched, exhausted, but not broken. On one rooftop, a group of children huddled under a broken beam, their faces pale with fear. A rescuer leapt into the water with a rope tied to his waist. He fought the current stroke by stroke, until he reached the house. The children's eyes widened at the sight of the stranger in orange. "It's okay. We're here to take you home," he shouted. But when he looked around, there was no home left to take them to. Still, he tied them one by one, and the team pulled them across the water. Their tiny bodies trembled with cold, but they were alive. Elsewhere, the rescuers heard a woman's scream. It came from a hut half submerged, only the roof visible. They smashed through a window and found her clinging to 2 goats, refusing to let go. "Save them too," she begged, tears mixing with rain. The team hesitated. Every second they spent meant someone else might be dying, but the woman's grip was unshakable. Finally, they lifted her and the goats together, dragging all 3 to the boat. Her sobs of relief pierced the roar of the flood. The rescuers worked tirelessly, pulling strangers out of death's grip. But for every life they saved, there were dozens they could not. They passed by collapsed houses where muffled cries had already fallen silent. The smell of drowned cattle rose in the air. At one point, they found a child's toy floating by itself, a small wooden horse, spinning in the current. None of them spoke. The villagers who survived gathered at higher ground, shivering in wet clothes, watching their world crumble. Some stared blankly, unable to cry anymore. Others prayed softly, their lips trembling. Children clung to their parents, too scared to even make a sound. But nature wasn't done yet. A fresh crack echoed from the mountain slope above. Rocks began to tumble, then boulders, and then the earth itself broke loose. A landslide. The rescuers shouted warnings, pulling people away just in time. Mud and stones buried what little remained of the lower village. The commander's voice was hoarse, but firm. "We can't stop. Every moment counts." For the rescuers, fatigue was not an option. Their uniforms were torn, their hands blistered from pulling ropes. But they pressed on. Helicopters thundered overhead, lowering nets and ladders, one after another. Villagers were lifted into the sky, their terrified eyes reflecting the chaos below. But there were still people missing. The shepherd Roth, who had lost his herd, was nowhere to be found. Some said they had seen him swimming after his calf. Others swore he had vanished into the current. His old mother sat on a rock, whispering his name again and again, as if the river might return him. And Fatima, the woman with the newborn, had not been seen since nightfall. Rescuers searched every broken house, every rooftop, calling her name, but no voice answered. The fear in the air thickened. As evening approached, the storm finally began to break. The rain thinned into a drizzle, and a pale light touched the valley. For the first time in 2 days, the villagers could see what had truly happened. It was worse than they had imagined. Fields of wheat were gone, granaries washed away, roads torn apart. The ancient stone bridge was just rubble beneath the waves. Half the village had vanished, swallowed by water and mud. The rescuers lined up the survivors, covering them in blankets, handing them biscuits and water bottles. Children munched quietly, too tired to cry. The adults sat in silence, their eyes fixed on what was once their home. But then, from the far end of the valley, came a faint cry, a child's voice, weak, desperate, but alive. The rescuers froze. Their commander lifted his hand. "We're not finished yet." They turned back toward the ruins, their bodies shaking with exhaustion, but their hearts burning with one last hope. Somewhere in that wreckage, life was still fighting, and they would fight for it too. The rescuers followed the faint cry, their hearts pounding louder than the river. The sound came and went with the wind, sometimes clear, sometimes drowned in silence, but it was enough. They moved fast, climbing over heaps of mud, splintered wood, and twisted tin sheets that once formed roofs. Every step was dangerous. The ground was soft, sucking at their boots, threatening to swallow them like quicksand. But the cry returned weak, trembling, unmistakably human. "There," shouted one of them. They spotted a collapsed hut, its walls flattened, its beams half buried under stones. A tiny hand poked out from the rubble. The rescuers rushed forward, pulling at the debris with bare hands, ignoring splinters and blood. Inch by inch, they freed a boy no older than 6, covered in mud, trembling but alive. The boy coughed, his lips cracked. He whispered a single word, "Ami." The rescuers froze. They searched the rubble again, lifting every beam, every broken plank. At last, beneath the wreckage, they found her Fatima. She was unconscious, her newborn still pressed against her chest, wrapped in her torn shawl. Against all odds, the baby's tiny cries pierced the chaos. A cheer erupted. The rescuers lifted them gently, rushing them to the helicopter. Fatima stirred weakly, her eyes fluttering open for a moment. She saw the rescuers, then her child in safe arms, and a single tear rolled down her cheek before she fainted again. The valley, once a graveyard of silence, now carried the fragile sound of life. But not all were as fortunate. As the night returned, the rescuers gathered the bodies they had recovered, men, women, children, even animals. They laid them side by side on the higher ground, covering them with plastic sheets. The wails of relatives filled the air as survivors identified their loved ones. Some broke down and collapsed, others simply stared in silence, their grief too heavy for words. Roth, the shepherd, was still missing. His mother refused to leave the riverbank. She sat on a stone, her eyes fixed on the raging current, calling his name again and again. He will come back. The river can't take him, he promised me. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. The rescuers continued their search through the night, their torches flickering across the ruins. They carried the wounded to makeshift medical camps, distributed food, and lit fires to keep people warm. Their bodies were broken, but their spirit was unshaken. They had become the last line between despair and hope. The storm finally ended. The skies cleared, and for the first time in days, the villagers saw stars. But the beauty of the night sky only deepened their pain. How could the heavens shine so brightly after so much loss? Morning came, and with it, silence once again. The helicopters lifted the last survivors out of the valley. Trucks rumbled back to the cities, carrying the wounded. Only a handful of villagers remained behind, staring at the ruins of their homes, unwilling to leave the land of their ancestors. The rescuers, too, prepared to leave. Their mission was nearly over. But before they departed, the commander stood before the survivors. His voice was calm but firm. You are alive because you fought. You held on. But remember, this rivers never forget their path. Water always reclaims what belongs to it. Rebuild if you must, but never forget what nature has shown you. The villagers listened in silence, their eyes glistening with tears. As the rescue teams left, the valley seemed to exhale. The sound of their vehicles faded into the mountains, leaving behind the echoes of weeping and the whisper of the river. The people of the village would never be the same. They had lost everything: homes, cattle, fields, neighbors. But they had also gained something unshakable: the knowledge that in the darkest of nights, even when the world collapses, humanity rises. Strangers had come into their broken valley, risked their lives, and given them hope. In time, they would rebuild. New walls would rise. Children would laugh again. Wheat would grow in the fields. But deep in their hearts, the scars of that night would never fade. Every time thunder rolled, they would remember the roar of the cloudburst. Every time the river swelled, they would see the faces of those they lost. Nature always reclaims its way. Rivers remember their course. Mountains shift, clouds break, and storms arrive without warning. But as fragile as human lives may be, the will to survive is stronger still. The boy who was saved from the rubble would grow up hearing this story, told again and again. He would remember the hands in orange jackets pulling him from death. He would remember the cries, the silence, and the stars above the ruins. And one day he would tell his children, we lived because strangers cared enough to fight for us. The valley would heal, but the story would remain a reminder of both devastation and resilience. The flood had broken their homes, but it had not broken their spirit.